Good evening, and my name is Corinne Jackson. I'm the Communications Director at the Okanagan Basin Water Board, and I manage its public outreach program, Okanagan WaterWise. Before we get started, we want to make sure that you are able to hear all of our panelists this evening and the film. So please make sure to put your audio on mute, and then you will be ensured better sound quality. Before we get started, I want to give thanks and acknowledge that we are broadcasting this event from the traditional and unceded territories of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. Thank you for joining us this evening, and a happy early UN World Water Day. Of course, UN World Water Day is actually celebrated on March 22nd each year. And this year we're holding our event a week early. But we hope that in addition to joining us today, you will check out some of the other events that are planned around the Valley that are happening next week. And I'll tell you more about those later at the end of the evening. So each year, we pick a water-related film that illustrates some of the issues that we're dealing with here in the Okanagan. And this year, we picked CBC The Fifth Estate's Come Hell, BC Underwater. And not just because Tamsin Lyle, who's featured in the film, is an old friend of the Okanagan Basin Water Board, who's come and spoken a number of times to the water board and to the public about about flood mitigation in the valley. But we also wanted to show this film because the story that the documentary weaves is one that we all recognize and can relate to. Flooding, but also droughts, wildfires, the impact from years of intense logging and infrastructure that can't keep up are all stories that we can relate to. The visible scars that are left on our landscape and the ones that aren't necessarily seen, but are very real. And those are the effects that these extreme weather events are happening for all of us and that all of us are feeling and experiencing. So with that, we invite you to watch Come Hell, BC Underwater. And following the film, we will have our local panel present, and then we will open it up for questions and answers.
I'm Mark Kelly. On this edition of The Fifth Estate, catastrophic floods.
We are just next to the river. I'm so scared.
Communities cut off. Lives on the line.
There was nothing we could do for the people that you knew were alive under the mud.
British Columbia is a province that's bearing the brunt of a changing climate.
The last few days have been incredibly difficult for British Columbians. Heavy rains, strong winds, flooding have devastated entire communities of our province.
There was really nowhere you could go.
Our infrastructure is built for a planet that no longer exists. We design and build our infrastructure based on the climate of the past.
Yet our investigation shows warnings have been ignored time and time again.
I think it was preventable and it was predictable.
Making this a disaster just waiting to happen.
What our response shows is that for governments, experience has become making the same mistake over and over again, but with greater confidence.
And there's one question that keeps coming up.
It's all gone.
Shouldn't we have seen this coming? Here in beautiful BC, there were signs this wasn't going to be a normal fall almost 3 weeks before the floods hit.
We've seen some pretty big storms and nothing like this at all.
A low-pressure weather bomb pounded Vancouver Island and BC's south coast, knocking out power in 9,000 homes.
Oh my God.
Then 2 weeks later, a rare tornado touched down at the University of British Columbia, just outside Vancouver and near the airport.
You okay? Yeah, okay. I'm okay.
Stunning, experienced meteorologists.
It sure had our collective jaws on the ground when we saw a tornado off of YVR, something that we've never seen before.
But something bigger, something more severe was building over the Pacific Ocean.
seeing upwards of 20 millimeters an hour is fairly normal, but seeing 3 or 4 hours like that is really a head scratcher.
What's called an atmospheric river was heading inland. These rivers in the sky are bands of moisture hundreds of kilometers long. Many harmlessly supply needed rain and snow, but this one was something worse.
What's incredible and maybe terrifying to think about is that climate change actually projects atmospheric rivers to not only get more frequent, not only to last longer, but also to get more intense.
So if climate change is signaling more extreme weather events, why weren't we better prepared for this one? On November 9th, 4 days before the storm struck, Environment Canada issued a snow warning up to 25 centimeters for the BC interior.
Okay, that's an eerie sound.
2 days later, the U.S. National Weather Service started escalating warnings for northern Washington, calling for a major flood stage event, and that residents should be prepared to take action, and informing them where to get sandbags.
We definitely saw an atmospheric river coming. We saw it build throughout the week. It really looked like it was going to be hitting the coast and moving south, and actually really focused on Washington State. We see that and we say to ourselves, okay, that's impressive, but so far it's not affecting our jurisdiction.
On November 13th, the storm changed path, barreling towards BC. Environment Canada revised its forecast, calling for up to 150 millimeters of rain. But BC's Ministry of Forests downplayed the threat. Rivers are expected to rise rapidly Sunday and ease on Monday as the heaviest rainfall passes. November 14th, this is what was heard twice across the border on the American side. A flood alarm telling residents to brace for high waters, move livestock to higher ground.
Hi, this is Bruce Bamman. I was notified not that long ago that the air raid sirens in Sumas, Washington are going off.
The alarm was heard by some on the Canadian side of the border, prompting this BC MLA to send out a warning of his own on Facebook.
Now, in the past, what that has meant is that the Nooksack has flooded, has breached its banks, and that the floodwaters are on the way to Sumas. Look after yourselves, be careful.
Then later that day, the atmospheric river hit. Disaster quickly followed. Roads and bridges swept away. Communities swallowed up by the rising waters. In the BC interior, landslides left entire communities cut off from supplies, medicine, food, and help.
You can't predict what the weather's going to be like more than a week or so into the future. But we absolutely can say that the statistics of weather are changing.
Catherine Hayhoe is a world-renowned climatologist, originally from Toronto, now based in Texas.
We know that these naturally occurring atmospheric rivers are getting more intense and they're dropping a lot more rain in a warmer world. Simply because warmer air holds more water vapor. And so now when a storm comes along, there's a lot more water vapor in the air for that storm to sweep up and dump on us than there was 50 or 100 years ago.
Ever since the middle of September, we have been dealing with extraordinarily active weather, generally speaking. You know, we're talking about over 200% of normal precipitation, including 5 atmospheric rivers, 3 bomb cyclones, a tornado, and who knows what else before 2021 is over.
No area may be more vulnerable in BC than here in the Fraser Valley, a short drive east from Vancouver. Flat agricultural lands surrounded by mountains and at the mercy of the temperamental Fraser River. The region relies on a series of dikes and pump stations to hold back seasonal floodwaters.
Everybody stop by that flashing light, please.
This pump house normally keeps the Fraser River out of the Sumas Prairie. This storm pushed it to the brink of failing, if not for 200 volunteers who showed up to protect it by piling up walls of sandbags, trying to turn back a climate catastrophe.
Earlier this morning, we expanded the Sumas Prairie evacuation order. Approximately 1,100 homes are now impacted.
I was watching what the River Forecast Center was saying. And, you know, there's that pit in your stomach where you're thinking, is this the moment where I get to say, I told you so? We know there are atmospheric rivers, and we've known for a long time that this was going to be a big concern for winter flooding in BC. And as someone who pays attention to this, you could see it coming.
Tamsin Lyle is an engineer who helps communities reduce their flood risks. She went to survey the damage a week after the storm hit.
Okay, there we go.
So right now we're seeing into the United States. This is the old Sumas lake bed. Right below us right now we have the Sumas River, which used to be a natural river that would drain this area. It doesn't anymore. It's now a diked system. So flowing out that way, the Sumas River, that's flowing out through the pump station into the Fraser River. And right under us right now is what used to be a lake and is the lake again. And it's thousands of people's homes and animals. One of the most productive agricultural regions in all of Canada is right under our feet now.
Now those farms were underwater, along with their livestock and their livelihoods. A century ago, the prairie was a lake, drained to make way for these farms. It didn't take long for nature to try to reclaim the lake bed. In 1948, a third of the Fraser Valley sat under murky black water. Thousands had to be evacuated. The valley has occasionally flooded since, leading many to wonder if all the measures to hold back the waters are enough.
My husband was up all night because we knew there was an alert. By 6 o'clock, I looked outside and it was like we're in the middle of a lake.
Some, like this family, Pavan, Kabir, and Narinder, felt utterly abandoned in their time of need.
I quickly ran to the front of the house and I could see that there was a puddle at the front of the house where we had brought our dogs in, and we just covered it with a towel, but with like an hour and a half, it was like a foot of water in our house.
They called search and rescue. No one came.
And then I had to call them again because from our house, ours wasn't a priority because we were on the upper level and we were safe. But from our house, we could actually see that the dike was breaking. So that's when we were panicking. We're like, we need to get out of here now because the dike is going to break and then it's going to flood a lot more.
Strangers in boats brought them back home to save what they could.
I think the community's coming together, like how they sandbag the Barrowtown pump, how we know there's people stranded in Hope and people are getting the meals. Even here, like sometimes there'll be people standing here with boats just in case somebody needs help, but it's just civilians. It's not like a government agency that's providing any of that help.
The first warnings came not from the province, not from the town.
The actual alert was from Facebook. Really? Yeah. And I could see where the evacuation area is. And right before bed, they were like, okay, now they're gonna put an alert on. So they extended the area, so they put everything in yellow, like alert that this area is now on alert. And then the next morning is when they put it all on evacuation, but it was already like we were already in water.
There are warning systems in place in BC, just not centralized. It's a patchwork of local and regional alert systems triggered at the discretion of local authorities.
The province has been in continual contact with local governments, and we're working to support those affected. Local governments are monitoring the situation in their communities and standing up emergency operation centers as needed.
Andrew Nikiforuk is a journalist covering environmental issues.
You know, I mean, the first response from the British Columbia government is that we're not responsible for informing people of a looming disaster. That's all up to municipalities. So, I mean, lack of accountability is a symptom of a system in real trouble.
So responsibilities are downloaded to people like Abbotsford Mayor Henry Braun, who chose not to sound the alarm.
And I want to be very clear here. It was our decision not to activate the provincial alert ready system for the whole city of 162,000 people at that time. So we didn't want to alarm the whole city.
Mayor Braun bristled at any suggestion he didn't act soon enough.
If you're asking me, would I do it again the same way? Yes, I would. Everybody in the prairie knew that there was an emergency. The prairie was flooded. There's no sense sending an alert out that's going to scare 162,000 people, which is what the population of Abbotsford is, the 300 or 400 people that were out there at that time, they already knew there was an emergency. All they had to do is look outside the window of their house. The water was everywhere.
I think there's a lot of different people that have to take ownership of this problem. And when we're looking at this kind of scale, I mean, I think the province, especially the province of about 20 years ago, 2003, 2004, has a lot to answer for in terms of downloading the responsibility from the province, who had the better capacity to look at this at a regional scale, to local governments who are now, don't have the capacity, don't have the expertise.
Downloading responsibility, lack of expertise can have catastrophic consequences in other parts of BC as well.
It's very sad.
Coming up after the break.
When we try to speak with the provincial government on logging, I feel that we're talking to the wall because they don't listen. We need to plan together, because if we don't, more catastrophic events like this are going to occur annually. We need to be heard.
Look at this bridge. There's nothing left of it.
As the mammoth atmospheric river moved eastward from the Fraser Valley to the BC interior, it left a trail of damage, a trail of death.
It was the scariest thing I've ever seen. I just turned around and I'm just watching the whole side of the mountain come down and taking out these cars and everything just being swept away.
It hit our back wall in our bedroom there and literally knocked us literally onto our feet. And we were in 2 feet of water.
Like a freight train going through your middle of your house, that would have been about the way it was. It took 35 seconds to get our house full of mud and dirt.
BC's coroner's office would later confirm 5 dead in the mudslides. Lives lost along this stretch of highway near Lillooet. The mud washed away highways, railroads, and bridges, leaving people stranded in their cars awaiting rescue.
I'm so scared because we are just next to the river and under the hill. Cars were driving up and down, up and down.
The entire community of Merritt, population 7,000, was told to leave.
We're on evacuation alert. We're actually being evacuated right now.
Heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking. Because you can't do anything about it. Didn't expect this. Nobody expected this.
Many climate refugees ended up an hour's drive away in Kamloops.
This is my property here. This was on the first day.
Cassidy Sobchak watched the waters claim her home.
There was water, basically. I lived in a colander. Like, water was coming in the basement windows, it was coming in the front door, it was coming in the back door. It completely filled my basement.
She fled in her pajamas and sandals.
What you see in here is what we have basically right now. Like, we basically got away with the clothes on our backs.
Yeah, it was awful. We started to see that it started to erode underneath our house. So we grabbed what we could at the moment, and yeah, we got out.
The front part that faced the river, the floor went. So I entered the house stupidly, and then a big crack. Gone, just gone. It went under. The river just took it under and gone. Within seconds.
As people fled Merritt, Mayor Linda Brown was heading back to her community.
I got a call as I was driving up the highway, and we knew the rains were coming, and they were coming hard. We were driving through rivers of rain on our way home. Shortly after that, the highways were closed. But by the time I got home to Merritt, my staff had phoned me and said, we're looking at the charts. This was a Sunday afternoon. We're looking at the charts, and there's something wrong here. We don't know what it is, but we have to let you know that there may be something happening. By the time the early evening arrived, they knew that something catastrophic is going to happen, but they had absolutely no idea of how big it was going to be.
The BC Rivers Forecast Centre issued a warning late on Sunday afternoon when they noted that there was going to be a lot of water flowing down the Coldwater and that this had the potential for flooding in the Merritt area.
Greg Lois is Merritt's information officer.
We had no idea that it was going to be like this. When we were watching the gauges that show the river levels down the Coldwater, and when the gauges further up the valley started showing that they were rising dramatically, we assembled the Emergency Operations Centre.
Floodwaters were bearing down on vital city infrastructure, forcing officials to make tough choices.
And so we then began considering whether or not it would be possible to run a city without a sewage infrastructure. And we knew that was when that we would have to evacuate absolutely everybody. We realized that we were going to be dealing with something Merritt had never dealt with before.
Those gauges measuring water volume in the Coldwater River were the only warning the city got about the magnitude of the flood.
They didn't get any phone calls. This was because of their diligence in looking at websites and what was happening, just based on a gut feeling of how much rain we're getting. And if it weren't for the efforts of staff, it could have been a bigger disaster. By midnight, we had people knocking on doors and we had people evacuating before the big flood hit. And that credit goes entirely to staff. And I admire them for that.
The rainwater was coming right down the middle of the road. Lower McPhail, to me, I doubted if there's even a road there anymore. Because that was 3 o'clock Sunday afternoon. And all the culverts up there were maximum capacity. The creeks were overwhelmed, they were flooded over.
Lee Spahan is chief of the Coldwater Indian Band, 15 kilometers south of Merritt, and one of 3 Indigenous communities that issued their own evacuations.
The flooding of the river, all that ground over there was all underwater. It washed away the access to the road. The water breached both sides of the banks of the. I'm shocked that they still have hydro. With the trees that are there, it actually saved probably the house from being washed away. The 2 homes there, they were probably underwater by about between 2 and 3 feet of water.
And if Coldwater's neighbor Merritt felt isolated and alone through this, Chief Spahan says his community fared even worse.
No alerts or nothing. And to find out that they were evacuating the city of Merritt, everybody was in shock because, really this is happening this fast. But a lot of people were pretty upset and frustrated because of the lack of response from the city, but also from the provincial government, because there was absolute no warning. I'm tired. I feel burnt out, but just to try to make sure that our members are safe and that they're fed, that's the biggest worry, to make sure that they're safe.
There's an awful lot of homes that are destroyed. Some of them will never be able to recover from that. Others they may be able to fix. But these are people that are losing their livelihood and losing their homes.
It didn't take long for that loss, coupled with a sense of abandonment, to turn into seething frustration.
I don't think any of us are getting what we need right now. I think that maybe if the government could step up and help these people out, it'd be really nice. Lots of us are out here and we don't need to be. Everybody out here is freezing cold and we're standing out here. We've been standing here for 2.5 hours, so maybe Trudeau should come and stand out here for a while. See what it's like.
Like after the fire season where you evacuated everyone to the same place, should you not have somewhat of a plan of how this works or how it should go?
What's your message to the government?
Get it together. This is ridiculous. There are people suffering who cannot help themselves. It's sad. It's so sad.
Call it disaster fatigue. These same residents were put on evacuation alert in August. The threat then? Wildfires. Ironically, it was rain that helped spare Merritt. But the fire damage around the city compounded the flood damage to the city.
Well, because there were a lot of fires in the region over the summer and a lot of the hills and trees have been burned, there is nothing to hold the water back. And we had rain for days and days on end. And that rain just came down and it all ended up in the river, and the river just did its thing. And it was nasty, and this catastrophe is a result of both the fires and the flooding of the cold water.
These are satellite images over the last 35 years showing the disappearing tree canopy around Merritt, extensive logging, fires, extreme heat, even a pine beetle infestation have led to the weakening of the soil leading to the landslides.
Anyone who's familiar with the interior of BC and how narrow the passes are, how narrow the rivers are, how extensive the logging has been over the last 100 years. And then you introduce something like climate change, which changes the whole hydrology, the whole water regime. And yeah, you're going to have trouble, big trouble.
In BC, they've already been talking about, why are we logging old growth forests? You know what? When we have trees, those trees keep the soil anchored, prevent landslides. They're a lot healthier and more resilient when forest fires come along. And they soak up the water when we get the heavy rainfall. And they take up carbon too.
We've been putting pressure on the provincial government about the logging, but they need to sit down at the table with First Nations leadership to make that happen, because they need our knowledge so that way we can work collaboratively to make it work. Because we all live in this world, but when they're only looking at it one-sided, it never works.
You look down at an individual farm and realize that the barn is up to its rafters. It's horrible.
When we come back.
It's one of my proudest moments is that I kept that line in that report where I said flood risk governance was broken, and we were asked to tone the language down, and I didn't.
There are so many ways to measure the impact of the catastrophic flooding in BC. The number of people displaced, the number of livestock that perished, the cost of the cleanup. But a helicopter ride over the area near Abbotsford says it all. Tamsin Lyle has studied the Sumas Prairie Basin for 20 years.
It's so beautiful. And you look down at an individual farm and realize that the barn is up to its rafters. It knows what's on the inside of it. It's horrible to think about.
For more than a century, there's been extensive diking, pumping, and planning to try to keep the water away. But last week, those protections failed and the lake returned. All it took was floodwater to spill over the aging Sumas River dike, next to Highway 1, which links BC to the rest of Canada.
Oh, here's the breach right below us. The big breach.
We've known about these problems. In fact, one of my colleagues this morning said the Sumas area is one of the most studied flood problems in all of Canada, and yet we still didn't do anything better.
And for those living next to it, the Sumas dike would unleash chaos in the basin below.
Narinder's taking Savna outside.
Remember Kabir, Pavan, and Narinder? They were left to grab whatever they could as floodwaters were rising in their home by the minute.
So the whole bottom floor, all the floors ripped out. There's at least a 1.5 foot of water.
The sofas are floating around.
And Narinder's cedar farm, gone.
My tractor's all underwater. ATV side by side, my welders, my truck loaded with the trees.
But could all of this have been prevented? That's a question people are starting to ask.
There's water in the truck now. I think knowing that this is a lake bed, that this was a lake before, maybe they need to be more prepared. I think the climate's changing. The weather is getting warmer, we're getting more forest fires, and we're going to get more flooding.
So what did the authorities know about the looming threat of a flood? And who was supposed to make sure these dikes could withstand the test? In British Columbia, those are complicated questions and a political hot potato.
To do that, we have to stop the water from coming All the way here.
Each day brought a new crisis for Abbotsford Mayor Henry Braun, but he's worried about the long-term impact.
This is enormous, and the aftermath, I don't think we fully appreciate yet the devastation and how long it's going to take to recover. I think that's going to be years.
The challenge of keeping these waters at bay has been a concern for years. This vast area of farmland stretches across a patchwork of local, provincial, federal, and international jurisdictions.
This big straight highway is the border.
Just south of the Sumas Basin is the U.S. border and another source of tension. The Nooksack River is located in Washington state, but when it overflows, that water heads north, flowing downhill across the border and towards the Sumas Basin. In 1990, that's exactly what happened, destroying homes and causing millions in damage. The danger of floodwaters from the U.S. has preoccupied mayors from Abbotsford for decades.
And there was a commission, a trans-border commission between Canada and the United States, and they did all sorts of wonderful things and came up with a study. But out of that really has come nothing. We all knew this was a problem. The city itself has done studies, recent studies, imploring federal or senior levels of government to do something about it.
Floodwaters from the U.S. are one thing, but it's the threat within BC that has communities across the Lower Mainland really worried. They're at the mercy of an aging series of dikes. This whole region has been largely re-engineered by man, a complicated, intricate weave of 600 kilometers of dikes and levees designed to harness nature and hold back rivers from taking back the land. But it doesn't always work. This report in 2015 found the Sumas River dike was presently too low, substandard, and likely needs to be updated.
We knew that the Sumas dike was low, or it shouldn't be at that level, or it should be raised. But local government doesn't have the financial wherewithal because we only collect property taxes, and we can't build for our dikes. The impact on our dikes, if we have to build them to the standards of the senior levels of government, is a $400 million bill 2 years ago. This isn't just peculiar to Abbotsford. This is peculiar to our neighbors in Chilliwack and Agassiz and Kent and Hope, Township of Langley downstream. I would say in a few words, money. This is a big bill. We've warned for years and throughout my term. We have not been investing in our infrastructure at every level for decades. And this is what happens when you ignore warnings.
On the other side of the Sumas Basin is Chilliwack, 30 kilometers from Abbotsford. For days, it was cut off from the rest of the country. Store shelves were emptied. Thousands of homes evacuated.
We've got, you can see how many different major water bodies.
Jason Lum is chair of the Fraser Valley Regional District.
This is the most serious emergency in my time here, and I've lived here my whole life. And I cannot recall another catastrophic event of this nature in the last, I'm going to say, almost 100 years. It's heartbreaking. Yeah, it's heartbreaking. Absolutely. Yeah.
And Lum believes this heartbreak never had to happen.
I think it was preventable, and I think it was predictable. I've participated in studies and panels where I've raised the same concern, it seems, for the last 10 to 15 years. There's going to be a time and a place where we're all going to be held accountable for our role.
So who should be held accountable? The province sets the standards for dike safety, but local communities are the ones that have to pay for it. And in 2015, this map showed the majority of dikes were in need of urgent repair.
You look at the regional district, and even though it's a large geographic area, you've still got very, very small service areas with, sometimes less than 100 people. It's absolutely asinine to think that they could pay for a multi-million-dollar dike upgrade. It's unfair to just leave the responsibility to the local governments and the regional governments. We do not have the capacity to handle it.
We have all these local governments who are unfortunately competing for the same resources, and they're doing exactly what they should be doing, fighting for their own constituents and their own communities. It doesn't make sense to manage water on the scale of the local government.
In fact, we found alarms have been raised in report after report, dozens in the last 2 decades. In this 2015 study, the province was warned that none of the dikes assessed in the Lower Mainland fully met the provincial standard, and that many could be expected to fail during a large-scale flood. Another in 2016 found that a major Lower Mainland flood would be Canada's most costly natural disaster. And in 2018, the BC Auditor General found diking infrastructure will likely not be sufficient in the face of increasing flood risks. Just this May, Tamsin Lyle wrote a report for the BC government. She says bureaucrats told her to tone down her findings.
We said the flood risk governance system in BC is broken, and we highly recommended that they take some of the authority back, and also, of course, that they fund these things better. They said, can you take that out of our report, please? It's one of my proudest moments is that I kept that line in that report, and we were asked to tone the language down, and I didn't.
In the BC capital, Victoria, there's a small team working for the province who oversee dike safety and flood risk. Lyle says they've also been sending warning signals to their superiors.
I know that these folks have been banging their heads against a wall for the last 2, 3, 5 years, trying to get the attention of higher folks at the government on these issues, and it's a pretty thankless task.
BC's Ministry of Forests oversees the Dike Safety Office, but our questions were directed to Deputy Premier Mike Farnworth. Minister Farnworth, I want to ask you about some decisions that have been made or not made in the past in BC. In 2015, the province commissioned a report on the state of dikes in the Lower Mainland. It assessed 74 dikes and found that 96% of them did not meet the provincial standard. Since that report was published, how many dikes have been brought up to standard?
Well, there has been an ongoing program in terms of trying to bring dikes up to standard. For example, February this year, we completed a survey in terms of the dike, what's called the dike crest, to see where things are at. There have been investments in terms of diking of about $105 million over the last couple of years. At the same time, there's also been investment in terms of flood mapping to get a much better understanding of the nature of the flood risk.
In 2015, there was a report commissioned by the province that found the Sumas River dike was, quote, too low, substandard, and needed to be updated. Why wasn't it fixed?
We have had an ongoing dike repairing and dike investment program within the province, as I said, about $105 million, along with additional flood mapping and working with local governments to get a good understanding of the nature of our dikes.
We've spoken to municipality after municipality says that they've been asking for more financial help from the province, and their cries for help have not been answered.
What we have seen in this province is an unprecedented weather event that none of the experts expected would be the way that it was. And what I have also explained to you is that the responsibility for diking was transferred from the province to local governments a number of years ago. One of the lessons from this event, obviously, is the need for continued investment in dikes, and in my view, a stronger role for the province in that process.
But for Tamsin Lyle, that admission comes far too late.
I mean, the province has known or has had the capacity to know, because there's been reports on this for decades. If you are in a home that's been flooded and you've lost your pictures, you know, your baby pictures, your grandparents' heirlooms, and all of those things, it's incredibly emotional, and it's so frustrating, and you feel so angry. So it's hard not to say something when you know that we knew this was coming.
Every day I just come here, park my truck here and watch, see how deep water goes now. If I can go back. I just come here every day. Everything is underwater.
When we come back.
I can't really put people back in the community and then trying to evacuate them out of there in the spring. And then the creeks and that, where we're going to come out will be swollen. So I don't need to have that heartache of trying to rescue people again.
It's been 10 days since an atmospheric river dumped record amounts of rainfall on parts of BC. Now the floodwaters are slowly receding, and what they reveal illustrates the challenges people face next. About 20 members of the Shaken Indian Band are now stranded in this work camp, part of the Trans Mountain Pipeline construction project.
We don't know when we're going to go home.
Yvonne Joe is a band counselor.
We live in a remote community, but we call that home. And when I think about leaving, we're also a very spiritual people. The day I drove out, I called on my ancestors to take care of the land. And now we'd have a home to go home to. So it's very emotional. It's a very emotional time.
This is what she and others left behind. 40 kilometers north of Merritt, the community was still recovering from the summer forest fires. After going from one climate calamity to another,
The valley that's been devastated is down in that route there.
Band Chief Arnold Lompro says he doesn't know when people can return home.
Realistically, I'm gonna wait until next either May or June after the spring runoff, because I want to know what's going to happen, and I can't really put our people back in the community and then trying to evacuate them out of there in the spring when the creeks and that where we're going to come out will be swollen. So I don't need to have that heartache of trying to rescue people again.
So who will be there for them? And so many others in BC who have lived through a year of chaos and survival. And do governments at all levels now see this calm after the storm as a time to act decisively?
What used to be a 1 in 500 year event is probably now a 1 in 50 year event or a 1 in 5 year event. They don't understand and appreciate that the scale and the pace of everything has changed. And this is just the beginning of climate change.
I really hope that we do this differently next time, but I also am cynical, having seen them not do it the previous 20 times.
For Tasman Lyle, there are no more lessons to be learned. The time to act is now.
It's just incredibly hard to see that we didn't make good choices that would have enabled the river to do what the river needs to do, but also allow us to live in this space better. I know that we need to live here. We can't sterilize this land. It's, one of the most productive agricultural plots of land in all of Canada, and it's people's homes. But we can do better than this.
And while governments calculate the costs of a cleanup and compensation, what about the human cost of this climate crisis?
It's just knowing that we're not going to be able to go back home is devastating. And they're talking about 2 years, maybe, if that, and they're going to change the road to get to home. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Is this going to happen every year for our kids and our grandkids and our great-grandkids? We don't know. But we have to do something to slow down on the logging and the mining, because that has a huge impact on Mother Earth. And this is a message not only from Mother Earth, but from the sacred water that goes down, is You better take care of me or I can wipe you out in an instant. That's what we've been told, what the elders were saying is that's how powerful water can be.
If you have a story you think needs to be told, send us your tips to fifthtips@cbc.ca. For a more confidential way to contact us, visit our website at cbc.ca/fifth and click on Secure Drop.
So we hope that you found the documentary informative. And, I could be wrong in thinking that it's relatable, but I don't think I am. Maybe you haven't had to flee your home from fire or flood, but many in this valley have, and you probably know someone who has. And certainly, if nothing else, everyone has felt the effects of the wildfires we've been experiencing, with smoky skies in the summer, air quality warnings telling us it's safer to be indoors, when in years past we would have been at the beach instead. And last summer's heat dome, of course, also had people seeking shelter indoors in their own homes if they were lucky, but otherwise in community centers or malls. And last summer, another CBC crew actually came out to BC. It was CBC Radio's The Current. And they came out to talk to people in Lytton and in Ashcroft, the Stetcheson First Nation, and in the Okanagan here, talking about the fires and the drought and the heat dome. And I had an opportunity to talk to the folks at The Current and to talk about what we were seeing here with various climate or extreme weather related events, and talk about the work that's being done here in the Okanagan by the Okanagan Basin Water Board and its partners. But then, I was asked by Matt Galloway, by the host, a very, getting more personal, and asked, what do you worry about when it comes to climate change and its effect on the Okanagan? And I couldn't help but think about my kids, who are 16 now and almost 18, and thinking about the next generation and the one after that, and all the work that's been done that we've been working with the Okanagan Nation Alliance. They've been working so hard for many years now to bring back the salmon. Couldn't stop thinking about that. And then, of course, thinking about the farmers whose livelihoods are on the line. But at the same time, I noted that, we have solutions, and we just need to work harder. We need to put our shoulder to the wheel and move with real and deliberate intention on these issues, and not next year, but this year. We need to work on this today. We need to work on it tomorrow and in the weeks and months ahead. And so I'm very happy to introduce our panelists tonight. If you want to turn on your cameras, and you can wave as I introduce Day Out, acting on solutions to tackle these issues head on in our cities, in our forests, on our farms, in local streams, rivers, and lakes, for the fish and all that depend on a clean, healthy water supply. And with that, I'll introduce our panelists, who will each speak for 5 minutes or so, and then we'll do a Q&A. So in the order that they'll be presenting, Mark Dehaniuk, do you want to give a wave? So Mark is a professional engineer and is the City of Vernon's manager of infrastructure. And Mark and his team are responsible for all aspects of Vernon's infrastructure data, planning, renewal, and improvements. And we have Dave Gill. You want to wave? There you go. And Dave has been the general manager for Intitik Resources since 2013. And his group looks after all aspects of managing West Bank First Nations forest tenures, including landscape level planning, operations, and forest stewardship, working to ensure all values on the land are looked after for generations to come. And then we have Kirsten Hannum. Hello, Kirsten. She's an agroecologist and with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Summerland. And Kirsten and her team aim to enhance the resilience of the BC tree fruit sector through effective and efficient soil, nutrient, and water management practices. And in previous lives, she's also worked as a soil scientist with BC Ministry of Forests and as a policy analyst with Natural Resources Canada. And then we have Carrie Alex. Carrie is a fisheries biologist and fluvial geomorphologist with Okanagan Nation Alliance. She's involved with several of ONA's river restoration projects that focus on improving habitats for fish and flood capacity. And then we have Anna Warwick-Sears, is the executive director of the Okanagan Basin Water Board, overseeing the agency's collaborative water management program, water quality improvement programs, and aquatic weed management since 2006. And Anna has a background in population biology and watershed planning, and serves as a member of the International Seuss Lake Board of Control. So before we start, I will just note that at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A tab, and we welcome you to put your questions into that box. Please note who the question is for, and then we will then provide the questions to the panelists once all the presentations are completed. So with that, we're going to start with Mark. Can you, Mark, tell us the story of what's happening in Vernon, please?
Yeah, thanks, Corrine, and thanks Okanagan Basin Water Board for giving me the opportunity to share what Vernon's doing in relation to, I guess, moving towards a more flood resilient and fire resilient community. So I'll just share my screen if that's okay. Sure. And I'll start this presentation. You can still hear me there, Corrine? Yep. Okay. So in response to flooding in 2017 and again in 2018 on basically Okanagan Lake, Vernon Creek, BX Creek, the city of Vernon started moving forward with a flood mapping, risk assessment, and mitigation project. And really the objectives of the work that we started was to really put together some mapping that we could use for land management, emergency planning, public awareness, as well as get an idea of where we needed to do some infrastructure upgrades. So from that study, there are 7 main recommendations. Here, I'm just going to close that. We really needed to put a flood bylaw in place, as well as update our OCP to include a hazard area. And so we actually just took that to council, at least the first report to council in regards to the bylaw and OCP to council this week. So we have a little bit of follow-up to do on that, but all of these recommendations and the path forward was endorsed for council. So we're now working on each of these specific items. We're in the process of creating a flood emergency plan based on the new mapping. So that would include updating our emergency call out list based on the mapping, coming up with a detailed operational plan, in regards to when we activate the plan, and as far as the river monitoring, as well as just monitoring each of the crossings, and even potentially we're looking at the feasibility of constructing temporary diking. We identified some flood risk at our water reclamation facility, the sewage treatment plant, similar to Merritt. During our design event and the 20-year event, there is some flooding at the Vernon Water Reclamation Center. So we're putting together a site-specific hazard assessment, as well as a mitigation plan for should we see that design event. There's 3 main structures in the Okanagan Landing, so on Vernon Creek, near Okanagan Lake, that are recommended to be upgraded for capacity that will literally hopefully prevent flooding for hundreds of residents. And then one of our other major recommendations is to update our erosion and sediment control plan. The image in the top right of the screen is just a graphical rendering of the sediment pond we're building this summer. And the picture down below just gives an idea of how much sediment we see in many of our structures on Upper BX Creek annually. So just putting together a detailed operational plan, updating our geomorphology for sediment transport on Upper BX Creek are key items to protecting our community. So those are the main recommendations. And one of the things that we really wanted to do is make sure we communicated this to the public. So we took a very similar approach to what OBWB did with their flood story map, and created Vernon's flood story map. So on that flood story map, it goes through all the terminology, but also each resident can type in their address and see how flooding would impact their specific property. This is just a snapshot of the hazard mapping display, but residents can also take a look at the actual flood mapping that would correspond to their property. So the other item I was asked to give a brief update on was just what the city is doing in regards to wildfire. So this is a snapshot of the White Rock wildfire from Ellison Park. In 2014, the city did their community wildfire protection plan. That was integrated into our official community plan as a hazard area. So it specifies some requirements for doing any subdivision or development within that area. And then more recently, the city's focused on applying the Fire Smart principles to all of the interface areas, so as well as city-owned parcels. So we're really trying to promote the public to adopt the Fire Smart principles. And then the city's been successful with several grants. So we have a couple areas that we're moving forward with, as well as a full-time coordinator that is really pushing that initiative. So that's that is the end of what I had. Yeah.
Snapshot view.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mark. They're big, weighty issues, and I apologize that that we have such limited time. So really appreciate you giving some highlights that that we can then discuss more in more detail. And so Carolina is giving us a hand now, and she's going to bring up Dave's slides. And Dave, we wanted you to come and talk today because TTIC is doing some really innovative and progressive work in the forests. And so wanted to have you present as well today. So I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Corinne. I appreciate that. And good job stick handling those technical issues. I know what that's like. And I guess you can hear me okay? Everything's good? Okay, yeah, my presentation is much less technical than Mark's. I've been working with Ntitik Resources, which is a West Bank First Nation owned forestry company since 2013. And over that period of time, our perspective on forest management has changed significantly as a company as we adopt more community values into the practices that we undertake on the land. I do not have a formal presentation here for you, just 4 slides and a few words to speak. But this first slide is indicative of much of what you see around the city of West Kelowna, just outside the city boundaries. We have these old forests that have overgrown. They haven't seen fire in over 100 years. There's a lot of ingrowth. There's a lot of surface fuels, and these forests are sick. These forests have not had any natural disturbances in them for quite some time. The next slide, if you will, is the same forest that I showed you earlier after we completed a fire mitigation treatment. This is in the area of the Mount Law fire that occurred in August. From the air, it was quite interesting flying that fire just as it was being mopped up. Where we had done this kind of treatment, the fire did get in here, but it was quite spotty and burned some grass and shrubs along the ground and scorched some of the trees. But for the most part, the forest itself is remaining intact. In fact, it skipped over much of this here and into private land that hadn't been treated, where it burned pretty ferociously. So this is some of the work that we've been doing around West Kelowna. We've done a little bit behind Peachland as well. But this is all part and parcel of a 7-generation stewardship plan that we've been working on, that's built on SEAL principles, and using those principles in our forest management and helping those principles guide our decisions. We have a community forest as well as a replaceable forest license, and we've actually, for lack of a better word, zoned that land base into 2 zones. One zone that we manage for old forests. We don't like to use the word old growth since it's too difficult to really define, but old forests, and another zone where we practice much of our forestry practices on. The old forest zone basically is centered around water, and water anchors those zones. So those could be creeks, they could be riparian areas around wetlands or lakes, and they form a connectivity network of forests that we intend to manage for old forest values. About 50% of our land base is zoned for old forests. And the key thing being that they have to be managed. In today's age, we cannot just put a fence around some old growth and say it's protected. It doesn't work here. It may work on the coast, but it doesn't work in the southern interior. So we take an active management role in these older forest zones, but predominantly to mitigate fire risk and address forest health issues, but doing so with a light footprint. Most of our harvesting occurs in the other zone, which we, for lack of a better word too, we call our forest management zone. And in this zone, we've been transitioning into partial cutting and smaller opening sizes, and tailoring our harvest methods to the ecosystems where that logging will occur. Our 7-generation plan is always a work in progress. As we learn more about the impacts of climate change, or as the values of the community changes, our 7-generation plan changes as well. So I think many of us have seen a plan completed, and then it sits on the shelf collecting dust and nobody ever looks at it again. This stewardship plan, our 7-generation stewardship plan, will be a live plan and will always be a live plan. Next slide, please. This is an area, and Cindy, you actually saw this area a few weeks ago in behind Peachland where we did some mitigation work. This stand looked an awful lot like the first photo that you saw. There was a lot of mistletoe in the Douglas fir, a lot of intermediate trees that weren't doing so well. It was just too dense for a healthy forest. So our logging crew went in and took out most of the intermediate sized trees, which were about half the height of the trees that you see here. And then we left a few of the intermediate trees, but patches of smaller trees as well. This is an area that with the ONA, it's intended to have a surface burn completed on this later on this spring when the conditions permit for that. I should also say that we work with the ONA Forestry Working Group. We're a member of that, and our working group also includes two different tiers within the working group, one with the province and one with the other licensees. And together we are working together to take a more collaborative approach on how we're managing our forests in this area. And there was a lot of reference to that in the documentary that we saw earlier. So one step at a time, and hopefully we're all moving forward in the right direction. That's it for my presentation, Corinne. So happy to take questions. Oh yeah, here's another slide. I forgot about this one. This was an operation. We harvested this area in 2020, right in behind, well, right on Trepanier Bench, if you know where that is. So it's an area near the Trepanier water intake on the Trepanier watershed system, and very close to, well, it's right behind a neighborhood there. This was an area where we removed about 40% of the trees and left 60. So this is what it looked like about, I would imagine about 6 weeks or so after we completed harvest. You can still see some slash piles in the background there. So a new perspective on how we want to move forward on the harvesting. And yeah, like I said, I'd be happy to take some questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. All right. And we will now move on to Kirsten Hannum, who is going to present on some of the work that's being done to help farmers prepare for the challenges that we're seeing and they're experiencing, and those challenges for which also include food security. So Kirsten, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Corinne. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Yes. Okay. I also want to thank Mark and Dave for going first. Those were really fantastic slides and great information. So I'm going to probably be a little bit more brief, but you've given me lots to think about. So as a research scientist, I love data. So I'm going to start with a slide with a few figures on it. The graph on the very top left of this slide was produced using weather data that's been recorded all the way back to 1916. And each bar represents a count of the number of days each year that were warmer than 35 degrees Celsius at the research center in Summerland where I work. So we can see a fairly strong trend, particularly in the last few decades, of increasing number of days that are warmer than 35 degrees Celsius. So we are seeing definitely on the ground warmer temperatures, and this summer was the warmest of all on record, at least at Summerland. So what does this mean for farmers? We can get a taste of this by looking at the figure on the bottom left of the slide, which shows the relationship between the maximum daily temperature and potential evapotranspiration rate. So what do we mean by evapotranspiration? This is essentially an estimate of how much water would be lost from the soil surface and lost through transpiration through plants in a day. And when I talk about evapotranspiration, I'm talking about the water that moves through a well-watered plant. So imagine an apple tree. An apple tree is essentially acts like a crazy straw. One end of the straw has roots in the soil, and it's constantly sucking water up through its system, and then the water flows out through little holes in the leaves called stomates. And I have put a picture on this slide of stomates, which are these little openings in the leaf. Now, we want plants, or we want a crop tree like an apple tree, to always be well watered so that the water is always flowing through this tree and the stomates are open. And this is important when we want to ensure that a tree is producing a good, healthy, productive crop, because when stomates are open, carbon dioxide is moving into the stomates at the same time as water flow is moving out. And carbon dioxide and water are the important raw materials, or the building blocks for photosynthesis. So as long as those stomates stay open, photosynthesis is going to be continuing, and we're maximizing the amount of carbon that's being pulled out of the atmosphere and turned into an apple, and the sugars in the apple, for example. So one way that these increasing temperatures that we're seeing on the ground is affecting farmers is by increasing the amount of water that needs to be applied to maintain crop productivity. Can I have the next slide, please? And another way that these extreme warm events are affecting us is shown in these figures that we see here, which I took at the research station in Summerland this summer, shortly after the heat dome. So on the left, you see cherries that are showing really strong dimpling and mottling and pits because of heat damage. When we cut those cherries open, it was almost like they were cooked in the middle. And some cherries were even turning into little raisins on the tree because water flow just couldn't keep up. So more water was being lost from the cherry than was being pumped into the cherry, and they just turned into sun-dried little cherries right on the tree itself. And we also saw a lot of loss of apple yield because we had sunburn damage, and a lot of apples just either fell off the tree or they just weren't marketable. So these are increasing concerns for fruit producers for sure. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is my last slide, and it's looking a little funny compared to what I imagined it looked like, but that's okay. So what we are, the kinds of research that we're doing at the research station, I've kind of divided into two categories. And these categories are based on either using water in different ways to increase resilience to climate extremes, or altering how much water we actually need to use for irrigation. So one of the most important practices is we have a long history of doing research at the agriculture station in Summerland on this, is making sure that irrigation is carefully scheduled and that the soil moisture is monitored and tree water stress is carefully monitored so that the water that's lost to evapotranspiration is replaced through irrigation. That's one really important step that we try to support growers with knowledge about that. But events like this heat dome event that occurred in the summer have really taught us or showed us a few other avenues that are going to be really interesting to pursue. For example, using water to strategically and efficiently irrigate the drive row. You can see the figure in the top right hand of this slide shows a really lush grass in between the apple trees. And what we have been told by several growers this year is that having orchards with this lush drive row actually helped cool the orchard and protect the fruit from heat damage. So even though we've been focusing efficient irrigation on the crop trees or vines in the Okanagan Valley, maybe there is utility to sparing some water for maintaining drive row to help cool the climate within within the orchard or vineyard. Other ways that we're looking into deploying water in different ways for improved climate resilience. Our colleagues in Washington and Oregon are doing a lot of research looking at the utility of overhead cooling or fogging systems to help use evaporative cooling for protecting fruit from heat damage, or even strategic timing of water use. So I'm working with some students at UBC who are looking at possibilities of applying post-harvest deficit irrigation in cherry orchards to make that water that would be used available for other crops that are harvested later in the year. So working together, we might be able to make sure that there's water available for all the crops by prioritizing who gets water when. Other techniques fall into the category of reducing the need for water. So you can see the figure in the middle of this slide shows a surface mulch that was applied to reduce the amount of water that's lost to evaporation from the soil surface. And other tools like foliar sprays or shade nets can be used as an alternative to evaporative cooling for protecting fruit from sun damage. And finally, in the longer term, we're looking at changes in orchard architecture, maybe altering how fruit trees and vines are pruned or how they're oriented within the orchard to protect them from that intense sun that really causes a lot of sunburn and water loss from the orchard. So I and my colleagues have produced quite a few videos about some of these practices, or even the last few months. And so I put a few search terms at the bottom of this slide so that if you'd like more information, feel free to Google and you should be able to come up with some videos that provide more detail. And with that, I will turn it over to Carrie.
Thank you. Can I get the next slide, please? Now, this is a picture, an archival photo of the Okanagan River in an annual flood. It's not an impactful flood. It was very sort of an average flood. And this is what most of the Okanagan River, Mission Creek, Trout Creek once looked like, way back. Actually, not that far back. 1950s is when most of these rivers were channelized. So the impact for flooding that I'm talking about is really actually quite recent. It's just in the last 50 years. Next slide. And what happens in the cross section here is when you remove a lot of these natural vegetation, which is delicious for real estate and places that want to put their development right next to rivers and creeks. I got an animation. If you could just do one click. The water that would normally be coming down in the spring tends to can get pulled up through the trees. It can get held in wetlands and floodplain areas, and it stays within the system. And it actually mitigates for drought later on in the summer because the water then slows down and it stays within the groundwater. What we always have to remember is when you're looking at a river, it really is just the tip of the iceberg. All of that groundwater underneath that's also flowing is also the river, and it's moving. So to recharge those groundwater areas and suck that water back in and suck those waters into the trees and the riparian growth was a big way that floods were managed prior to channelization and diking. Cottonwoods in particular are massive sponges. They're very hollow. They hold a ton of water, and they actually release bits of water all summer to their friends around them. They also create their own little mini atmospheric river, not like the atmospheric river in November that we saw, but they create their own little river humidifiers or humidity above the canopy that kind of also will flow through the system, and it attenuates flooding waters. Next, click. So this is how the water I was just describing in a flood would flow over into the floodplain. Next slide. So all of that stuff is great for fish. One more click. What it does, though, what we did was we took the Okanagan River that once looked like the top and had that great capacity, another click, and we channelized it and diked it. This is just above the Soyuz Lake. So now we don't attenuate those floods and we can't hold them anymore. We moved them very, very quickly from A to B. So now we don't have that ability to attenuate those floods, hold them, release them again in drought situations, and slow down the impacts of flooding by letting it flood out through its floodplain or even a modified setback floodplain. And this creates when fisheries biologists and fluvial geomorphologists look at these two rivers, and the channelized and diked river looks very, very sick to us. It's hurting. It can't move its stuff. It's struggling to sort of support the indigenous fish species that once thrived here. Next slide. So when rivers move from low flow to an annual flood flow, every time the discharge increases, the velocity doubles for every 10 times increase in discharge. Once the flood flow spills over into those floodplains, though, there's very little increase in velocity. The bulk of what we're seeing in massive flows with floodplains tend to come from more abrasive forces, trees or big rocks kind of being moved through the river system. Next slide. And this really, if the minute we take that away, because natural rivers have sort of a 20-to-1 or 50-1 width to depth ratio. So for every 1 meter of depth, it would have a 20-meter width or a 40-meter width. But what we've pretty much built in most situations are these channelized systems, which have more of a 2-to-1 or a 5-to-1 flood flows. And then we dike right up into the edge. And it's just that the land on both sides of these rivers are delicious for real estate and for municipalities to buy and sell, but we've actually created an even bigger problem for ourselves because now we don't reduce the velocity in larger flows. So the minute we get to a 5, 10, or 15-year flood event, these flows are not slowing down, they're speeding up, and the consequences and risks to us are even greater than it was before. So we've created our own problem. This reduced capacity of the rivers, it is also a problem in resiliency and climate change. So we don't have most of these rivers are built way too narrow for even what is our normal 100 and 200-year flood flows. And there's already a lot of concern over a number of the dikes that we currently have in sort of Mission Creek and in Trout Creek and a number of the other areas. So we've created our own problem. And most people jump to the solution, we'll just build the dikes higher. I mean, we've gone this far this way, just build them higher. Unfortunately, when you build them higher, people don't want to take out of their backyards because as you build them higher, you have to build them wider at the base, and that takes up land. So they end up encroaching even further into the river. And you see this over and over again through Mission Creek, Mill Creek, Trout Creek, Okanagan River. They just keep getting narrower. So in Mission Creek, as an example, it was more of a 35 to 40 meter wide creek naturally, and even greater than that in many places prior to channelization. Now it's almost less than 20 meters in so many areas. So we've added risk and consequence to any flood that's going to start coming down the river. And then we've seemed to have put our houses bizarrely close. And these are all spaces that are at risk, and the river is going to write that whether we want it to or not. And unfortunately, this is not what a lot of people want to hear. They want to hear engineering solutions to these problems, but there's not a lot of engineering solutions anymore. Things need to be set back. Individuals need to understand what risk they're taking by having their house next to rivers. And just for a plug for fish, all these rivers that have dikes or riprap or channelized areas, those are areas where there's no fish or reduced numbers of fish. It's very well studied that the minute you have a riprap bank or diked bank, the fish assemblage goes way down. As an example, the Okanagan River that flows through the Osoyoos Indian Band near just north of Oliver can have on an average year about 150 rainbow trout running through it. And that's even in the summer. The setback section, they have dikes, but sometimes the dike's just on one side, or the dike is set back, but not really set back to a full 30 meters. In those situations, we have 75 rainbow trout on average. And on all these channelized sections, like our bottom photo, there's 0. So we've failed in managing for fish currently, and we're about to fail even greater for them if we don't kind of learn from our mistakes. And our mistakes are now going to seriously start impacting ourselves. We don't set ourselves back from rivers. So unfortunately, people that want to live near rivers, they're kind of watching them die a little bit, very, very slowly. The fish are not interested in being in a lot of those sections that have these banks that are all rip-wrapped and channelized, and they're at risk. Last slide. One more click. So in areas where we have been able to set back rivers, so in all of our river restoration projects, there has been an ecosystem focus, but also one that I think the dike managers are getting very happy with a number of the outcomes, because flood conveyance or flood capacity has been able to increase due to these dike setbacks. And they build these beautiful things in the spring where you can see clean water coming out of side channels that back into a murky water system. So those are these areas and floodplains that are cleaning themselves out and cleansing the water before it returns to the system. And those are refugia for fish. And other areas where the riparian growth is really sucking up the flows and growing in leaps and bounds. So that is all part of the Okanagan River Restoration Initiatives projects. And that is it for me. I think we're on to Anna.
Oh my goodness. So what I'm going to talk about today is, I think, one of the biggest long-term projects that the Water Board is working on right now. And this really came out of all the flood work that we did after 2017. I thought that it would be great to watch that Fifth Estate video again, because I wanted to have us reflect more about what we can learn here in the Okanagan. And particularly a thing that came up for me today is that just that sense of urgency that you were getting from the people in that video, which was filmed like a week or two after the big floods in November. It's so close to us. The people in Merritt, they're like our neighbors. You know, it's so real and present when we see that in British Columbia rather than in some other part of the world. This photo I took in a little park near my house in Kelowna, and there's a whole series of them, and they just, I was looking at them again today, and it's just kind of flabbergasting, like this condition where the lake is meeting the land. Normally, like right now, there's a seawall or a big stone wall, and the water level is really low. There's a big kind of gravelly, sandy part at the bottom of the wall. It's very different condition than it was. This was in June of 2017. But it's one of my favorite illustrations of the flood. But when we were doing after the flood happened, we worked with all these partners to develop flood maps for this main stem lake system, all the way from up by Vernon and Okanagan Indian Band lands, all the way down to the US border for all the lakeshore and rivershore areas. And that flood mapping involved a whole lot of high technology work, but also a lot of climate modeling and looking at what is the probability of this flood happening again. This was considered to be about a 1 in 500 year flood. But the issue is that if you look at the climate modeling, this type of flood is, several years, it's no longer 1 in 500 year, and it becomes the time period between when you get these type of floods becomes shorter and shorter until by mid and toward the end of the century, they start happening really frequently. So what seemed like a very major event, nobody alive had seen this in the Okanagan before, is going to become quite common to our children and grandchildren here, which is a real problem. And it is, especially as Carrie so eloquently talked about, we're building right around these areas, and we're putting ourselves into vulnerable situations. In many cases, there's nowhere to build outside of the floodplain, or it doesn't make economic sense to do it. You just have sprawl development. So we're in this situation where we need to think about not only how we build, but how the water is managed and how we work with the water levels. So the Okanagan Lake is sort of it's basically a natural system, but it is also managed. And Carolina, can you advance the slide? It's managed by Sean Reimer, who probably has the toughest job in the Okanagan, operating this dam in Penticton. And it is very difficult for him to get through a season without somebody raging at him for either keeping the lake too high or bringing the lake too low. This last summer it was too low. Really, it's a condition of weather. In previous series, people have been unhappy that the lake was too high. In 2017, what happened is that we had a low snowpack. It was about 80% in February, similar to this year, by the way. And so Sean was holding water back in the lake, and there was not that much snow to melt, but there was a big, tremendous amount of rain that fell, which filled up the lake much faster than he could release it. And we ended up with this significant flood, although the precipitation in 1997 was about a third again as high as the total precipitation in 2017. It occurred in a different way, in a different amount, came as a big snowpack, happened over a longer period of time, so it didn't create the flood event. The point that I'm trying to make, and Carolina, you could advance it one more time so we can not embarrass Sean anymore. The point that I'm trying to make is that we really need to look at how we're managing the lake and the whole Okanagan Lake regulation system. And that includes the channel that Carrie was talking about. It includes Kalmalka Lake, includes all the series of lakes and the dams and the control structures and the dikes that move the water through the valley, or that the water moves through. So most of the structures were built in the 1950s, so they're aging. And the operating plan was basically developed in the mid-70s with the Okanagan Basin Study. It was developed for flood control. The main idea back then is just move the water as quickly as possible. It's been refined somewhat, especially with work with the Okanagan Nation Alliance on the fish water management tool, which is optimizing releases to improve the ability of fish to reproduce and move through the system. But it hasn't had a really thorough review and overhaul since the 1970s. And so this is what we are calling for. We worked with the province to develop this report. It came out in 2021. Brian Guy from Associated Environmental developed the report, and we organized it, and it was paid for by the province. And it is a whole plan of study of all the things that we need to know before we can make any changes to the operating plan. More climate work, more risk analyses for flooding, an idea about looking at alternatives for how we are managing the water in the dikes versus the unchannelized areas. There's a whole lot of work to do, but it is like one of the most important things for us to take on as Valley. And I just wanted to highlight that, especially in light of, that video people are talking about, well, what do we need to do? Why haven't we done anything in the Fraser Valley? This is our thing like that. This is like, we want to work on this. We're not going to stop working on it, and we don't want to keep pushing it until we figure out what is best. We don't want to increase our flood risk by we don't want to increase our drought risk by reducing our flood risk, and we don't want to harm the fisheries restoration that's going on. So there's a bunch of different things that need to be balanced and managed, but we all need to look at it as a community. So that'll be the end of my presentation. Thank you, Corinne.
Thank you. So we do have a couple of questions, and I'm also looking at the time, so I'm going to be quick here. But so San Vander Ross noted not the same situation as BC with the fires and logging and erosion time bomb, but the Netherlands has been planning to make room for rivers for at least a decade to ensure when the floods happen, they will. There's a place for the water to go, to be proactive. And I'm gonna ask, it will take a bunch of government commitment, she says, with financial support to ensure that BC can plan for the next disasters that will happen. And I'm wondering, Anna, do you want to say something about that at all? And
I could say a little bit. I could say a little bit. This has come up a lot in recent weeks because the province has put forward a watershed security strategy and is developing a new ministry. And the ministry is trying to put land management in under the umbrella of water management, and their strategy is bridging across all the different ministries that still have a little piece of water. So I think that the province is recognizing that this is something that needs to be done. The other thing that many of you will find amusing is that they've been getting a ton of public comments. They said huge amount of public comments on forestry. And so this has been coming in loud and clear in the engagement on the watershed security strategy. That engagement, by the way, is open for a couple more days. Friday is the last day if you want to go in and fill in their survey or write a letter and submit it, because one of the people who's working on that said, we were really surprised because this is a water strategy and everybody wants to talk about forestry. So it's not going unnoticed that this is in the front of people's minds.
It's of course related. So yeah. And I have a question, Dave, for you in a moment here, but Carrie, I'm wondering, did you want to speak to this making room for water at all?
Yeah, I think this is how we're going to survive. we have to rethink what a healthy river is, and I think we have to set ourselves back, and I think we have to do it a lot. There's a lot of places that are doing this as well, all over the world, where if you become flooded, it's terrible. Like, it's very empathetic. It's not that there's no sympathy, just that, well, then it's cheaper to move you upland than it is to put you back in a high risk space. And Grand Forks is doing this. Calgary tried to do this. They only got about 50% buy-in, which is unfortunate because they made it voluntary. And I think this is what's going to make a difference, because it's really our tax-based money that funds Emergency BC that again runs in and helps people, and people absolutely need help. That's not the question. But why are we helping people to stay in a high-risk space when they know this has happened a couple of times? Like, why can't we learn from our mistakes? So rivers are going to need to have more space in general. And you know what? That might be beautiful space. Look how well loved the Mission Park Greenway was. This could be just as well loved if it's set back, and if we had more of those all over the valley. So I don't think it would be a huge problem, but I think it's going to take a different way of thinking.
Thank you, Carrie. from Patty Meager. Hello, Dave. Thank you for the good work. With your vast experience as a forester, what are your thoughts on how major licensees' current operational plans, watershed assessments, and our risk assessments be amended, considering the new evolving climate change? In other words, to better prepare for drainage or wildfire reduction. We just heard the intense 1 in 100-year events could become 1 in 5 or 1 in 50. Do you think these plans should now be reevaluated? Can this be done?
Well, thanks, Patty. It's been a while since I've had a chat with you. I can't really speak on the hydrology and the watershed assessments. I'm not really qualified as a hydrologist. I'm a forester. But I certainly do believe that that the assessments that have been done in the past should be relooked at with that perspective on climate change, for sure. What I can speak more to is the whole concept of landscape planning and operational planning. And in my opinion, the place to start there is a collaborative approach to looking at the landscape as a whole and planning what activities could occur and what shouldn't occur in certain areas. And that has to be done in a collaborative approach. And with the ONA, we've been trying to start working with the licensees on doing just that. So these are areas that you will be looking at on the landscape that needs certain protection to protect certain values. And like I said earlier, where we're planning our old growth around riparian areas and so forth. I think there has to be, on the operational planning side of things, a closer look at doing different things on the land. Maybe that's smaller opening sizes. Maybe it's leaving more retention behind. Maybe it's looking at ways where you can still get some snow interception with the cover that you're leaving and some shading to reduce the peak runoffs. There's so many different things that can be done. And I think we just have to open our mind to that and realize that, you know, what may have worked well, the cookbook recipes of the past just may not be applicable anymore.
Thank you very much. I'm just gonna put out one last, looking at the time, just gonna put out one last call. If anyone has a question, go ahead and type it in the Q&A. But it looks as though there's lots of stuff going on the chat as well. So really good to see the level of engagement that continues at this time. So thank you. All right. Anna, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just with respect to all the interest in the that's coming up in the chat about working with the floodplain, I think we're going to have a number of other, ideally in-person engagements with the community about flood planning and flood mapping in the coming year, because there's a bunch more information that's coming out, and that there's a lot of work being done locally, like the work that Mark and his colleagues are doing in Vernon, but there's also work in Kelowna and Penticton and around the communities. It takes a lot to make those changes, and nobody wants to rush into it. But on the other hand, we don't want to wait too long. So yeah. I'm hoping that we can have that, that event in person.
Yeah. And so I just wanted to let folks know that, well, first of all, to thank you for joining us this evening. And we hope that you have found some inspiration and, as I said, some interest in the topic, but also thank Carolina for her help tonight as well. And wanted to just mention, for those looking for ways to have a positive impact, and just encourage you to go ahead and visit the website at okwaterwise.ca, where you'll find all sorts of resources to help you in your efforts in the valley to be more water wise. So as I had mentioned earlier, there are a couple of other events that are going to be happening in the valley, including the Okanagan Nation Alliance holding their Self Water Forum. So I did send a link earlier about that. And then the Peachland Watershed Alliance is having a pop-up party on the beach, also on March 22nd. So they'll have some information about that. We'll include it also on our social media feeds. But I think with that, I will thank you for joining us and wish you guys a happy World Water Day next week and say good night.